Thank you all for coming. It is great to be here with you. I am Derek Cressman, as I said moments ago. I am running for Secretary of State in order to make sure that people's votes count more than corporate money in our political process. I have spent the last 19 years of my career working professionally as a good government advocate with groups like Common Cause and CalPIRG. I was most recently a national vice president at Common Cause, where I was overseeing all of Common Cause's work in 35 different states, and our state chapters staff of about 35 to 40 people all around the country. And I fully realize that that is not the typical profile that we have here in California of a statewide politician, but that is exactly why I am running. I think we need to do something different, something dramatically different, because I think the stakes are pretty high in terms of whether or not we're going to be able to recapture democracy in any kind of a functional way. And to just talk about, why I care about politics and these issues for a second. How many of you all saw the newspaper stories on Monday, at least Monday in Sacramento Bee, front page, Sac B, talking about Antarctica? So seeing your guys' papers down here, right? Where scientists are now certain that the glaciers that have been there for millions of years are going to melt. And it is no longer a question of if, but when. And they're giving us a pretty big time range, right? It's like 200 to 800 years or something like that. And certainly if we take some, immediate steps, we can push it towards the 800 year. At least we hope that we can. But it was a pretty sobering moment for me to read that Monday morning. It kind of gives you a pit in your stomach, like we failed. Look what we did. I'm not ready to give up. I do live in Sacramento, about 3 blocks from a levee. Sacramento is the second most city in America prone to flooding and levee failure after New Orleans. So I'm personally very concerned about sea level rise. But I actually have a great deal of confidence that the American people and the people of the world could tackle this problem if we had a functioning public policy process. What it would take, you read Bill McKibben or folks like this, and they're pretty straightforward, and they say, we actually have a pretty decent estimate about the amount of carbon that we can pull out of the earth and put up into the atmosphere and avoid more than a 2 degrees Celsius temperature change. And it would be hard, right? It will be incredibly hard. It would require entirely restructuring the way our economy works. But we have done this in the not too distant lifetime. Think about what this country did during World War II, where we radically restructured our economy and stopped building cars and started building tanks and airplanes. And in the period of just a couple of years, massive changes in our infrastructure, in our economy, in our industrial activities. That's what this is going to take if we're going to head off a global climate catastrophe that could result in millions of people dying. And again, I'm optimistic that we can do that if we can get government working so that we're able to actually have a sound decision-making process. And the problem right now is our government is broken. We're not able to actually address that issue, many other pressing issues, because we no longer really have a government of the people, by the people, for the people. I don't know if people saw Al Gore's comments, partially in response to Antarctica, but partially in response to the Supreme Court's rulings in McCutcheon and Citizens United and elsewhere, where he said our democracy has been hacked. This is not an accident that we stumbled into this. This is a result of a 40-year intentional strategy by ideologues who were very determined to get ideological justices on the Supreme Court for this particular outcome. And they have done it. So it is a daunting situation. It is a serious situation. I am convinced that you know, the survival of my grandkids actually depends upon us doing something radically different in terms of our industrial activities. And that means doing something radically different in terms of our electoral activities right now. So pivoting to the moment right now in front of us, there are a couple of things that California's next Secretary of State can do to significantly improve things. And then there's some other things that are beyond the power, beyond the authority of that office or any single office, but that we need to find a way to do. And my campaign is about all of those things. So in terms of what's immediately achievable here in California, this is the good news part of the program. Right now, California ranks 48th in terms of voter participation. You know, we're beating 48? Texas, 48th. Embarrassingly low. But the good news is that we have passed through our legislature some pretty significant reforms in our voter registration process that's going to make a big difference. I'm talking about things like same-day voter registration, like pre-registering high school students. These are the exact same reforms maybe that you've seen be repealed in other states like Wisconsin and North Carolina for blatant partisan voter suppression purposes. We have them on the books in California, but we don't have them in reality. We haven't implemented them. And what's holding us back is the Secretary of State of California needs to complete a new statewide voter registration database to facilitate these reforms. And I've now seen 3 secretaries in a row, good people, smart people, progressive people, manage to not get this done. Federal government gave California $40 million in 2003 to build this database. And we've had one series of mishap in the office that have prevented that. Now, where things are at right now is almost exactly a year ago, in March of 2013, Secretary Bowen did sign a contract with a vendor to get this built. It's not scheduled to be done until June of 2016. And the name of this vendor, nobody had ever heard of until about last October, when suddenly everybody was hearing them every day in the news. The company's called CGI. Anyone remember why you were hearing about CGI last fall? Obamacare. This is the Canadian company that built the Affordable Care Act website. So that doesn't guarantee that they're going to screw up our voter registration database, but it means there's a chance. And not just because of this vendor. We know that IT projects are inherently difficult, and we've had major challenges with lots of IT projects in California government. But it's really critical that we have a Secretary of State who will ride herd on this problem, who will be on the phone at the CEO to CEO level with CGI, making sure that this gets done on time, under budget, and that it actually works. Because if we get it done, and if we implement same-day voter registration, which Common Cause worked to get passed in the legislature when I was there, the best academic research that I've seen indicates that that alone could be a 5 percentage point boost in voter turnout in California. More like 9 percentage points among young people. Okay? So that's a game changer for the next generation of California politics. It'll mean more young people voting. That means our electorate is more forward-looking and less backward-looking, right? This is the generation that's going to have to deal with the catastrophes of climate change that I was talking about. I think we'll make wiser policy decisions as a result. So that's something that is entirely within the control of the next Secretary of State to implement. That will be my top priority in the office, is making sure that that gets done, because it's incredibly important for the future of our state. Now, the second reason that non-voters give when they're surveyed in terms of why they don't vote, and this is particularly true among young people and particularly true among Latinos in California, is they don't feel like they have adequate and reliable information to make a responsible vote. And I think a lot of us feel this way. You know, even pretty educated voters, sometimes you're trying to vote for judge, right? And there are 2 names staring at you on the ballot, and you haven't heard of either one of them. And most of us like call some lawyer friend, right, and go, hey, what's the story here? But very little information. Right now, the Secretary of State is charged with sending out the official voter information guide. You all probably got it in your mailboxes about 10 days ago. And some people love it, and if you love it, we're going to keep it just the way it is for you. Some of us think that you couldn't invent a more boring document if you tried. Right? I mean, we're talking about black ink on gray newsprint. There's not a photograph in the thing. It's small font, incredibly dense. And a lot of people feel like these ballot questions are worded intentionally to try to confuse you. And in fact, sometimes they are, right? So one thing we could do, the state that invented the YouTube video and the Apple iPhone, why don't we take this and turn it into a digital app, right? Something that you can get on your smartphone, on your desktop computer. We could then do a number of things with this. We could give every candidate for office a series of online videos that they could use to make their case directly to voters, speaking in plain language. Speak in English, they could speak in Spanish, they could record it in multiple different. I'm actually going to LA in a week. I'm going to be recording a video that's going to be translated into Korean, right? So the private sector has figured out how to do this. League of Women Voters has a smart voter guide that you all may have seen. But we need to get this built into the official voter information guide. And that would create a level playing field where every candidate gets 2 minutes or 30 seconds or, we can play with the lengths, but same amount of time to make their case directly to the voters. And one that has 10 times as much money, maybe they can make a fancier video, but they've still got the same 2 minutes as every other candidate on the ballot. So, this would be a service to voters, right? You've got a one-stop shopping place to get all the information that you need. It's also a bit of a form of campaign finance reform in that we're creating a level playing field and we're creating a way for candidates to get their message out without holding their hand out to the corporations and the PACs and the special interests. So that's a big deal. That's something that the next Secretary of State can do. And the other opportunity that it creates is we can pull data from another part of the Secretary of State's office called the Cal Access system that does our lobbyist registrations and our campaign finance filings. And we could pull that into the voter's guide. A lot of you probably remember in November of 2012, we had a couple of very important ballot measures on, right? There was Prop 30, Jerry Brown's revenue measure. There was Prop 32, which was aimed basically at eliminating labor unions from the political process, but in the guise of campaign finance reform. And, about 10 days before the election, we saw a $4 million contribution and then an $11 million contribution winging into our state from these out-of-state groups. The biggest one was in Arizona called Americans for Responsible Leadership. And a lot of the pundits and actually the other candidates running for their office talk about, we need 24-hour electronic disclosure of campaign finance. Well, we had that. Within 24 hours, we knew there was this group that nobody had ever heard of called Americans for Responsible Leadership dumping $11 million into our state. But it wasn't really accurate or full disclosure. So it's not so much the speed that we need, but we need to actually get to the bottom of who these donors are. So in that instance, I worked to file a complaint with Common Cause at the Fair Political Practices Commission. The good news is 10 months after the election, we got a record fine assessed to two front groups for the Koch brothers. They paid $1.4 million, which is more than anybody's ever paid for breaking campaign finance laws in California. And they can afford it, but nonetheless, it at least sends a deterrent message to people thinking about doing this again. But at the end of the day, voters had no idea who these people were when they were casting their ballots. So this is what we need to fix. The really good news is just today, actually, Jerry Brown signed Senate Bill 27. He signed it. So, and that is thanks to the hard work of the California Clean Money Campaign, California Common Cause, Senator Lou Correa, the Fair Political Practices Commission, crafted a bill to make it impossible to just launder the money through passing it through multiple different shell organizations. You have to disclose the source of the funds at each pass-through and where it comes from. So that's the first thing that we needed to do to address the abuses that we saw in 2012. But the next thing we need to do is pull that information into the voter's guide. So it's not just sitting there in the Secretary of State's computer system and web page. It's right there when you're getting ready to make your voter decisions. You can look down and go, okay, $11 million, Americans for Responsible Leadership. Who's that? Click, you follow the link. There's the money right there in front of you. Nonprofits have been doing this for a long time. People might be familiar with MapLight, with the Center for Responsive Politics. So the technology exists, and the key improvement that we need to make in the Secretary of State's office is to start coding contributions by industry source. Because then you could search by industry source and see how much they're giving to all of the candidates. But also in the voter's guide, you could have every candidate for office, every ballot measure, and their top 10 funding sources by industry. I've started doing some of that analysis on some of the other candidates in the race, and it's pretty shocking when you add it all up and see how much somebody's taking from the payday loan industry, from the pharmaceutical company industry, from the banking industry. And then you look at particular legislative acts that they've taken. It's like, oh, I get what's going on here. But without aggregating it, you don't capture that because, there are hundreds of different payday loan companies, and some of them you can't even tell by the name of the company what it is. So we need to add this to our database in the Secretary of State's office, compile it in a way that's meaningful and useful to voters, and put it in front of them right at the time they're making their voting decisions. So that, again, is something that we can do within the power of the Secretary of State's office. It doesn't get rid of the big money in politics, but it at least shines a spotlight on it, and it does make it somewhat less effective, right? When you see a TV ad and you know that it's funded by the Koch brothers, that tells you something about the perspective of where it's coming through. And if it's purporting to be campaign finance reform, and you know that they've got a track record of suing to dismantle every campaign finance law they've ever run across, you might scratch your head a little bit, right? So those are some things that the next Secretary of State can definitely take on if they want to, if they choose to. That's what I'm running to do. That's a kind of a continuation of my life's work. At the end of the day, though, getting registered to vote and getting informed and even having the disclosure out there doesn't guarantee that people are going to vote. And in fact, in some ways, the disclosure can make things worse. It's a little bit like getting a CAT scan. It tells you you've got cancer. It doesn't cure it. And having cancer can be depressing, right? If you know people who've been through it. And especially if you're a voter and you're looking at two different candidates for a particular office, and you see, okay, this one's taken a ton of money from special interest ABC, and this one's taken a ton of money from special interest DEF. What's a voter to do, right? So it can be disclosed, but not really giving us that much choice. And in fact, it's the type of thing that actually I worry deepens cynicism, especially among young people. I've been traveling California over the past year on this campaign, and I've talked to countless young people who go, yeah, I'm registered to vote, but I don't bother because I don't think it matters. I don't think that my voice is heard. When they see a Sheldon Adelson or the Koch brothers, spending hundreds of millions of dollars, they feel like their voice gets drowned out. And, I would love to tell them that they're wrong and say, no, your vote just matters just as much as Charles Koch's and David Koch's. But it doesn't, right? I can't say that with a straight face. I think that's really, though, all the more reason why we need to vote and why we need to push back and get involved. We need to kind of move through that cynicism into anger, into outrage, and into action. Because when you look at what's going on, when you look at what's at stake, we no longer have the luxury of being complacent and cynical and feeling like our votes can't count. And quite frankly, all of the challenges that I've just laid out here tonight, they're pretty stark, but they're nowhere near as tough as what previous generations of Americans or other people around the world right now are dealing with, right? Whenever I think we've got things tough, I think about John Lewis, right? Marching across that bridge with water cannons and dogs coming on him. People getting killed for registering voters in the South of this country during the Civil Rights Movement. Think about the iron-jawed angels, right? The women who chained themselves to the White House gates in protest for women's suffrage and were hauled into jail for speaking their minds and went on a hunger strike. Okay, so we've got the system rigged against us, right, fair enough. But other people have too, and they've found ways to overcome it. And that's exactly what we need to do through doing things different. So that means we need different types of candidates to start running for office and for them to be supportive and make a difference and to win. So that's one of the reasons I'm running, is to offer voters an alternative. We can't just complain about, gee, we have all these turned out state senators running our Secretary of State's office. They haven't done a very good job, but if we only let turned out state senators keep running, that's what we're going to keep getting, right? So we need different types of people to run. We need them to do it without taking corporate money, which is how I'm running my campaign, which definitely means you're going to be outspent. And we need to find a way to win nonetheless. So that's a bit about the reasons I got into the campaign. Let me pivot a little bit about some of the things that Herb was talking about and talk about how I think we can take on the Roberts Court. And I am convinced that within my lifetime for sure, and maybe much sooner than that, we're going to see an end to the Citizens United ruling. And we have to. It's just morally offensive to have these 5 justices telling us that a corporation has constitutional rights like you and I do. And that's not just a problem now in the world of campaign finance, but in all sorts of other cases. Have you all been following the Hobby Lobby case? Anyone heard about this, right? So they're using the precedent of Citizens United now to say that a corporation has religious freedoms under the First Amendment. And those religious freedoms extend to the freedom under your conscience that a corporation has not to insure your employees under the Affordable Care Act for health care coverage that includes contraception. This is what it has gotten to. And beyond the Citizens United ruling allowing corporate money into our politics, we've had other rulings that created the super PACs that we saw in the last presidential election cycle. And just a couple of months ago, this guy Sean McCutcheon from Alabama decided that giving $123,000 to members of Congress just wasn't enough for him. He needed to be able to give more. And the Supreme Court went along. The same 5 justices are saying, yeah, unlimited campaign spending is the same thing as free speech. And we don't think it's corrupting for Sean McCutcheon to give millions of dollars directly to elected officials. I guess these folks haven't read the Li-Ling-Yi affidavit. But they seem to be impervious to facts and evidence. When Montana, which had had a ban on corporate contributions in place for 100 years, going back to some very real threats, not threats of corruption, actual corruption, where copper barons, people who owned copper mines, literally became U.S. senators by bribing state legislators. Montana reacted by banning corporate contributions. It worked for 100 years. Citizens United ruling came down. The Montana Supreme Court, when that law was challenged then, upheld it. And they gave very good reasons and evidence for why this was necessary to combat corruption in Montana. Supreme Court said, we don't care. We're not even going to look at your evidence. We're dismissing your law out of hand. So this is a bigger problem even than campaign finance, even than corporate personhood and Hobby Lobby. This is ultimately about sovereignty and restoring some checks and balances into our constitutional framework. It was never the idea of the founders that 5 rogue justices could just run the country based on their own personal political beliefs. And yet, that's what we're seeing. So we need to find a way to overturn these 5 justices and these series of rulings that they're coming down. I think the most straightforward way of doing that is for a constitutional amendment that would overturn these rulings. This is how we've gotten rid of the poll tax, for example. This is how we've gotten rid of Supreme Court decisions that struck down progressive income taxation 100 years ago. It's an appropriate mechanism that's laid out in the Constitution. It's also really difficult. no more difficult than dealing with climate change or winning World War II or winning the civil rights movement, but difficult, right? So let's think about, what does it look like? What does it require to pull something like that off? Well, the mechanics of it is you need 2/3 of both houses of the U.S. Congress to propose a constitutional amendment. You need 3/4 of the states, that's 38 states, to ratify it. Now, that's mechanically what's required. Politically, what's required is huge supermajorities of people across the political aisle, across the country, geographically, demanding this. Not just sending petitions, even though we need to do that. Not just sending letters, not just making phone calls, but looking for extraordinary level of tactics that are beyond our day-to-day politics. So I've been working on this problem since 1996, when I was actually the first advocate in the country calling for a constitutional amendment to overturn the Buckley versus Vallejo ruling, which is where a lot of this began in 1976. The Supreme Court threw out a lot of the reforms that Congress passed after Watergate. And it is worth remembering that after a sitting president was forced to resign, we actually did pass some pretty tough campaign finance laws. It is not impossible to get Congress in a bipartisan way to act aggressively. That's happened in our lifetimes. Supreme Court threw out about half of it, including mandatory limits on campaign financing. But where was I going with that? So that's our history. What's it going to take? Extraordinary tactics to solve this. When I looked at where we've come across similar challenges, the best example that I've come up with is passing the 17th Amendment for direct election of U.S. senators. U.S. senators used to be appointed by state legislatures. It was becoming very clear by the late 1850s or 1800s that this system was broken, because you had copper barons in Montana and other states literally just bribing state legislators to become a U.S. senator. So there was a big movement to change this. It got a lot of traction in the House of Representatives, as you might imagine, where they voted 2/3 of both parties in the House year after year after year to pass the 17th Amendment, dying in the U.S. Senate, because what we know is incumbents of either party are loath to change the rules that they got there by. That's scary, right? So what started happening is Oregon and California, I think California did this in 1892, they put measures on the ballot that were voter instruction measures. They weren't legally binding, but this actually goes way back to the Founding Fathers in a practice that was widely done at town halls and town meetings of, you send your representatives to the Continental Congress, and generally you say, you know what we're all about in this town, represent us, use your judgment, but on a small set of issues you go, here's exactly what we want you to do. And the Founding Fathers did this all the time. In fact, at the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, many of the founders were under explicit instructions, especially the folks from Delaware, which is why we have the U.S. Senate structured the way that we do today, is they were in instructions not to go for anything that didn't have equal representation by state, right? So anyhow, voters started doing this in the 1800s, and this eventually got us the 17th Amendment for direct election of U.S. senators. When I was at Common Cause, I started leading a national campaign to do this around the issue of Citizens United. So in San Francisco and Los Angeles, we didn't have to go to the trouble of gathering 55,000 signatures. We went to the city councils that had already passed resolutions and said, put a question on the ballot and give all the voters in your jurisdiction the chance to directly speak out about this issue, to instruct their members of Congress to pass a constitutional amendment, overturn Citizens United. In LA, 77% of voters did that. In San Francisco, it was 82% of voters who did that. Stunning margins. The type of margins you'd need to see if you were going to pass a constitutional amendment, right? But those are pretty liberal cities, right? Let's be honest about it. But we did the same thing statewide in Colorado, a presidential swing state, very purple. I grew up in Colorado Springs, one of the more conservative places in the country, I can tell you from firsthand experience. Montana, we got this on the ballot statewide there through gathering signatures. 75% of Montanans approved this at the same time that they voted for Mitt Romney. 74% of Coloradans approved this. It passed in every single county in both of those states, some of the reddest places in America. So we have demonstrated, and the public opinion polls show this too, we have the supermajority support. It really is 80% or so of Americans fundamentally disagree with these rulings, and that's true across the political spectrum. This is not a left, right, or center issue. So I've been calling now for a statewide vote here in California on this. The great news is Senator Ted Lieu has picked up this idea along with Hannah Beth Jackson. They have a bill in the legislature right now. It's SB 1272 that would place a statewide question on our November ballot this year, giving everybody in the state the chance to instruct their congressional delegation to overturn Citizens United ruling, to overturn the Roberts Court. So we're actually on the verge of making this happen. And my pledge as Secretary of State is I would hold a hearing in every congressional district up and down the state to find out if Congress goes along and if that particular individual member of Congress goes along. Because you can't go to court to enforce these things. The founders were very clear. These instructions are just that. They're instructions, they're not orders, they're not binding. You can't sue a member of Congress and force them to do anything. But you can tell them how you want to be represented. And the Secretary of State can certainly inform voters as to whether or not the member of Congress has acted upon those instructions. And then, at the end of the day, it's up to the voters to decide if they want to keep electing that person or not. And if they do, they do. But that is an extraordinary level of public pressure. It's beyond the normal politics. It's the type of thing that I'm convinced we need to do. And you guys are actually poised to make a huge difference on that bill right now for two reasons. One is Senator Jerry Hill. He is on the Senate Appropriations Committee. That's where this bill is at this exact moment. It has already passed through the Senate Elections Committee. And it'll be up to him to decide if it's worth the costs, which are fairly modest, of adding a question on the ballot and adding a couple pages to the voter's guide to explain what this is all about. Is it worth those costs to give Californians the chance to speak out on this issue? I think it is. I hope he does too. If he's your state senator, I would urge you to give him a call and let him know what you think about that. And then when it moves to the Assembly, it will go through the Assembly Elections Committee. That's chaired by Paul Fung. So just as it happens, this part of the state can play a crucial role in getting this on the ballot. There's some sort of cosmic justice to that, since this part of the state is where the problem began back in whatever it was, 1886, I think it was, the case of Santa Clara County versus Southern Pacific Railroad Company, which sounds like you're all familiar with, which was the first instance where the Supreme Court started granting some constitutional rights to these artificial entities.
I remember looking at it.
It was dicta. Yeah, I read that ruling so many times looking for where it actually says corporations are people. Never. Never does it say that.
No, it's in the blurb. Oh, that's what it was. Summary.
It's in the head notes. The head notes, which are written by the clerk, who happened to be a former railroad vice president. And there's some dispute as to whether or not these head notes are accurate, because he was quoting the Chief Justice, who then died before he had a chance to review these head notes. But the Chief Justice reportedly said, "We're not interested in hearing arguments about whether or not a corporation is a person and entitled to constitutional protections under the 14th Amendment. We're all of the opinion that it is." Now, that may have happened, it may not have happened. It doesn't really matter, because previous courts have gone on and believed that it did, and they have used that as a precedent to get to where we are today. So who knows what really happened there? We do know what's happening now. We know it's wrong, and we need to, we know we need to step up and do something extraordinary to change it. So I think we can do it. That is what my campaign is all about. I would love to have your support behind that campaign, and thanks for the opportunity to come talk to you about it.